Okay, my laptop has been dying so fast. I was worried I wasn't going to make it, like it was not going to make it here. And I get out to I pull in, I get up to my parking spot, I open my laptop expecting it to be 50%. It was 100%. That was a God wink. And I just was like, whew, okay, we got this. So yeah, I'm here to speak tonight. When I was thinking about who I wanted to speak about, I wanted someone who was really relatable, someone who was going to allow us to have some really honest conversations when we get into our breakout groups, and I kept coming back to Martha. It's not because, I think a lot of us are Martha, and if you are familiar with her story in any way, I say that, it's not because we're bad, it's not because we don't love Jesus, but it's because, we're responsible, we're capable, we're needed, we're dependable, and sometimes we're a little exhausted, just as Martha was. Before I get into all of that, I want to share some really important context about Martha that I think helps set the stage. So, who is she? She appears primarily in the Gospel of Luke, but she's also in the Gospel of John. She is the sister of Mary of Bethany, and she's also the sister of Lazarus. One detail that a lot of people don't know about Martha is that her name, Martha, comes from the Aramaic word, which means lady or mistress of the house. And that's really interesting because it actually hints that Martha may have been the head of the household. In Luke 10, verse 38, it says, Jesus entered a village and a woman named Martha opened her home to him. It wasn't Lazarus's home. It wasn't their home, it was her home. And that's really significant, especially in those times. She appears to have carried some real responsibility and authority in that household. So she wasn't just casually helping in the kitchen, she was likely managing the entire hosting experience in a culture where hospitality mattered very, very deeply, especially when hosting a rabbi. So again, when Martha is busy serving, and I'll read the full verse here in a minute, she's not doing something foolish or shallow, she's actually doing something incredibly honorable. With that, let's take a closer look at the story, which I'm convinced is not the full story. So back to Luke chapter 10, I'm going to read us verse 38, 39, and then I'll start to read 40. So it says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. So I'll pause there just to recap. Jesus comes to her home. Mary, her sister, sits at the feet of Jesus listening. Martha is working and serving and preparing everything. You can kind of picture that, right? I didn't have a sister growing up, but I do have two daughters who are 7 and 9, and I can pretty much tell you with 100% certainty how this would play out in my house if one was busy running around doing kid preparing and the other was sitting at the feet of Jesus or sitting in general. Exactly how it played out in the Bible. After she'd been running around and getting everything ready, finally Martha gets frustrated. In verse 40, it continues by saying, this is Martha speaking, says, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do this work by myself? Tell her to help me. And it even has an exclamation mark. But notice how she's not saying this to her sister, right? She is speaking to Jesus because she knows that it isn't going to matter what she says to her sister in that moment. Mary is giving Jesus her full attention in that moment. So she speaks to Jesus instead and asks, hey, can you deliver this message to my sister? I need a little bit of help. But instead of doing what Martha asked, in verse 41, Jesus responds, Martha, Martha. And I'm actually going to pause there. He says her name twice. And it's very easy to read past that. Martha, Martha, move on to the rest. But it's incredibly significant in both the Jewish and the biblical context. When someone is addressed by name twice in Scripture, it's usually a moment of deep affection or urgency or just very, very important. There's a lot of actually notable examples of this in the Bible, but Abraham, just before Isaac is spared in Genesis 22, and Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3. So like I said, there's a ton of notable examples, so I didn't want us to read past that part. Rather than scolding her, he's meeting her where she's at emotionally. He sees her anxiety before he addresses her actions. So as verse 41 continues, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. So usually when people read this story or are learning about this story, Martha becomes the bad example. Mary is the one who's spiritual. She's sitting at the feet of Jesus. Martha is the one who's distracted, hustling around, too busy. But again, I don't think that's the full picture. Jesus never criticizes hospitality. He never criticizes serving. In fact, in John 12, Martha is serving again. And I'll read you that quickly. It says, 6 days before Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. John simply states Martha served. There was no mention of her being anxious. There was no mention of complaint or her being distracted. Her service was presented as natural and an honorable expression of love. So that's why I believe that Martha's serving wasn't the problem. The problem was what was happening internally. Jesus said, you are worried and upset about many things. He doesn't say you're serving too much. Her issue wasn't laziness. It was overextension. It was pressure. It was anxiety. It was resentment. It was distraction. She had become so consumed with doing things for Jesus that she had missed being with Jesus. And I don't know, I see some head nods. That hits it right on the nail for me. Martha reflects so much of the pressure that women carry today. She's the always-on person, managing, hosting, planning, making sure everything else is handled for everyone else. Sounds like moms, caregivers, high achievers, women carrying the mental load of everyone, people whose brains never shut off. Martha isn't just busy, she's burdened by expectations. You can almost hear it, the frustration in what she's saying. Why am I the only one doing this? Why doesn't anyone else see what needs to be done? And then comparison enters her story. Her breaking point comes when she looks at her sister sitting at the feet of Jesus. That's what makes Martha feel so human to me. She's not distant. She's not a biblical character perfect. She's recognizable. I'll gladly speak for myself. I've been there. I've felt the resentment. I've felt the frustration, the anxiety, everything. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room. There's another cultural detail here. I'm going to detour us just a little bit to talk about Mary, but I thought this was really interesting, so I wanted to share this piece. So in Luke says that Mary sat at Jesus' feet, and the phrase meant more than just physically sitting nearby. In Jewish culture, sitting at someone's feet was discipleship language. It meant learning from a rabbi as a disciple. So when Mary sits at Jesus' feet, she's stepping into a role that's primarily, at that time, reserved for men. And when Jesus defends her, he's doing something radical. He's affirming that women belong in deep discipleship too. The story isn't just quiet time is better than chores. It's also women are invited to learn deeply from Jesus, and women are also invited to be disciples too. And that's what makes this interaction even more remarkable. He isn't criticizing her because she's a woman doing household work. He's inviting her into the same relationship with him that Mary has chosen in that moment. The beauty of this story is that Martha's struggle is not rooted in something that's obviously wrong. It's actually rooted in something good that has turned into something heavy. Her struggle often looks respectable. She's not reckless or lazy or irresponsible. She's actually very competent, but competency can sometimes hide anxiety. Jesus lovingly exposes what's underneath. You are worried and upset about many things. And some translations say anxious or troubled, which sounds a lot like modern burnout. I think it's important, though, Jesus responds to overwhelm with invitation, not with shame. He doesn't humiliate her or embarrass her. He says her name twice. There's tenderness there. It's correction wrapped in love. Martha's faith was actually really incredible. And this is the part of Martha's story that people often forget. In John 11, after her brother Lazarus has died, Martha has one of the deepest theological conversations in the Gospels. So in John chapter 11, it's verses 20 through 27, we hear, "So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give.' Jesus responded and said, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha responded, 'I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.' But Jesus said, 'I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?' Martha responded, 'Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into this world.'" So notice how when Jesus arrives, Martha is actually the one who runs out to meet him. And where does Mary stay? In the house grieving. That completely flips the script, right? Martha says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." I love it because it's honest. I've had similar thoughts in my journey with my brother passing. She's grieving, she's confused and disappointed, and still she goes to Jesus. And then she makes one of the clearest declarations of faith in the New Testament. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God." That's extraordinary faith, especially because she says it before Lazarus has been risen again. Martha shows us that faith and grief can coexist. You can deeply trust God and still bring him your disappointment. You can love Jesus and still ask hard questions. So to close us out, I want you to consider, maybe Martha's story isn't about choosing Mary or Martha. Maybe the point is not be Mary instead. Maybe the point is don't lose presence in the middle of pressure. Because Martha's gifting wasn't wrong. Her serving mattered, her leadership mattered, her hospitality mattered, but somewhere along the lines, the responsibility became anxiety. Performance replaced peace, and Jesus gently called her back to what mattered most. Martha reminds us, and these I like to reflect on, so if you guys want to close your eyes and just really soak them in, I feel like it gives it that added oomph. So, busyness is not the same as faithfulness. Good things can crowd out the best things. You can be capable and still overwhelmed. Serving Jesus is not the same as sitting with Jesus. Comparison turns responsibility into resentment. Jesus meets overwhelmed people with compassion. And maybe most importantly, your worth is not measured by how much you carry. Jesus did not ask Martha to become less valuable. He invited her to become less burdened. Thank you.